You're like a damn pod person.
Last year, Vince Gilligan graced us with a brand new show, PLUR1BUS. I'm a sucker for any Vince content, so I couldn't help but give it a watch. And yeah, we are so back. I've taken a moment to gather my thoughts on Season 1, as well as giving it a full rewatch for the purpose of this video. Today, I'm going to go episode by episode, and attempt to review them with an analytical rating, as well as my own personal rating. Both ratings will be on a scale of 1 to 5. Before we jump in, we just have to go over what I'm judging for the analytical rating. I've separated it into 4 categories. These are story, cinematography, acting, and dialogue. Story is fairly basic. I'll be asking myself, is the story moving forward, as well as is what's happening interesting. Cinematography, I'm not the best judge on, but I'm basically just looking for shots that stand out to me, as well as bits of visual storytelling that I'm able to spot. Acting and dialogue pretty much speak for themselves. Oh, also, just one last thing. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to be referring to the joined as others and the immunes as old schoolers, as these are the terms the production team use on the PLUR1BUS podcast. Alrighty, without further ado,
it's Plurbin time!
Our story starts a year before the joining. Right off the bat, a huge positive for PLUR1BUS is these on-screen timestamps. Personally, for me, I really love to know just how much time passes from moment to moment in a TV show. Scientists discover a strange signal, prompting all kinds of nerds to take interest. It doesn't take long for them to figure out this signal is actually an RNA sequence, which they quickly replicate and insert into rats. About 30 days before the joining occurs, 2 scientists clock in for a late shift working with these RNA rats. They notice one of the rats is supposedly dead. In an attempt to feel for a pulse, this lady takes off a protective glove as she can barely feel anything through 2 layers of gloves and ends up getting bitten as the little fucker is actually alive. Then, it begins. Everyone gets a little raunchy and starts making out, spreading the notavirus orally. A swarm of them begins swabbing the insides of their mouths and making smiley faces on petri dishes. We then cut away to meet our main character, Carol Sturcker. Carol has a book signing and we can immediately see that Vince humor seeping throughout this scene. It feels entirely natural too. This guy with the sword fucking kills me, man. She heads home with her partner, Helen, and it's quickly obvious that Carol hates her books. They wrap up the book tour and head home. Something I only noticed upon my rewatch was Carol and Helen accidentally bump bags. It's such a small thing, but it really highlights the contrast between the others and humanity, as you're able to see those imperfections that the others just aren't capable of. In the airport, we see a couple books, and I love the tiny little nod to Breaking Bad with this book cover as we see the symbol for Golden Moth Chemical. They then head out to a bar where Carol quickly notices planes flying above in a strange pattern. Also, some guy crashes his car because he had a few too many. Carol attempts to help him, but he's too shit-faced. Helen then gets all sleepy and decides to take a nap on the concrete. Carol freaks out and heads inside to get some help, noticing everyone tweaking the fuck out. She takes matters into her own hands and rushes Helen to the hospital herself, but is forced to steal this unicorn guy's car as she's locked out by her breathalyzer. Once she arrives at the hospital, she realizes that the tweaking is citywide and no one can be snapped out of it. She heads back to Helen with a stretcher and she briefly stares at Carol with a big smile plastered on her face and then dies. Carol tries to bring her back, but fails. Suddenly, everyone snaps out of it. Carol tries to figure out what the hell is going on, and everyone starts speaking in unison. It gave me chills on my first watch, and still gives me chills now. Carol quickly flees the scene and heads home, but not before a cheeky Tom Schnauz cameo. For those who don't know, Tom Schnauz worked on Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul as a writer and director. She attempts to get the news on, trying to figure out what's happening, and suddenly realizes the TV has a message for her, telling her to call a number. Davis Tafler is on the other line and begins to explain everything that's going on, including the RNA rats, and talks about how everyone is now linked with a sort of psychic glue. Carol also discovers she is 1 out of 12 survivors in the entire world. The others have no clue as to why this is the case and are determined to figure out what's wrong with her so they can fix her and make her join them. Episode 1's story is utterly fantastic. I think it was brilliantly plotted out and paced. It's an amazing hook, and really has you curious as to what the hell is coming next. It's also a super interesting take on an apocalypse. I really liked how Vince showed his hand almost immediately, by explaining exactly what the joining is, instead of wasting a season trying to figure out that aspect of it, which is a mistake that would have been really easy to fall into. I'm giving the story for this episode a 5 out of 5. Spectacular start. Vince really carried forward everything he's learned from his previous works as a director and put it into PLUR1BUS. This episode, and the show as a whole, is visually gorgeous. You'll rarely hear me complain about this aspect of the show. They also brought back Marshall Adams as director of photography, who had previously worked with Vince on Better Call Saul. I think this episode in particular has some great visual moments. I love this little sequence of shots when Carol saves Helen. The camera gradually lowers to the ground each cut. I also fucking adored this one of Carol driving through the town. It really allowed us to stay in her headspace throughout it all. Also, I'm a sucker for a wanna. Cinematography for this episode is unsurprisingly a 5 out of 5. A couple of small acting points I want to get out of the way first is this moment with Ray saying, "Fuck you!" The delivery on that line is fantastic. Also, side note, I wasn't 100% sure if delivery would come under dialogue or acting, but I settled on acting in the end. I also really loved Peter Bergman's delivery of the line,
So we can fix it.
That line paired with his lovely smile makes it much more sinister than it is on paper. Also, Miriam Shaw, the actress who plays Helen, did a fantastic job. She had brilliant on-screen chemistry with Ray, and I'm really hoping they bring her back for more flashbacks in future seasons. She's the star of the show, and she's the star of this episode. It's Ray Seahorn. What a performance she put on. She played pretty much 3 different versions of Carol throughout the episode. We've got Author Carol, tired of being an Author Carol, and my wife just fucking died Carol. My performance of the episode, of course, goes to Ray Seahorn, specifically when Helen dies. First off, Ray is excellent at crying, which feels like a really weird thing to say, but goddamn she is. It's so perfectly messy, which I just love. I've never really been a fan of just the single tear shit that a lot of actors do. She's so vocal in her crying, and it really provokes some great emotion in the audience. This moment is also really quickly followed by my other favourite moment, which is Carol freaking out at the others.
What the hell is wrong with you people?
Of course, acting is 5 out of 5. No notes. The dialogue this episode was fantastic. There's a moment in the bar scene with Helen and Carol where they discuss Carol's unpublished non-Waikara book. Helen encourages Carol to just go for it and publish the damn thing. Carol asks,
You really think Bitter Chrysalis is that good? I think people will love it.
on first watch, it's a pretty simple line, but it's immediately recontextualized upon second viewing. As we find out in episode 4, Helen thought Carol's books were just insisting people will love it is such a great way to answer without answering for herself. The line feels so intentional. As I mentioned earlier, Vince's comedy shines through Carol's book signing, and a line of dialogue that really stands out to me is,
This is Paulina and support person.
it's such a simple line of dialogue, but it just kills me. There's also a great sequence of dialogue later in the episode where Davis explains the joining to Carol. It's a very exposition heavy scene, but is written in a way where it feels entirely natural, and he manages to wrap it up in about 5 minutes, which, considering the info dump we get, it's pretty quick. There's also a lovely bit of comedy trickled in the dialogue with Davis.
Davis Taffler happened to be nearby and intact, and he was wearing a suit.
I'm giving the dialogue for this episode a 5 out of 5. It felt very natural and flowed nicely. There wasn't a moment where I raised an eyebrow and was thinking, that's a weird thing to say. And now, I will be discussing every drink Carol consumes this episode. Our first drink of the series occurred off screen. Helen blocks Carol from driving and Carol responds with,
I had 1 Tito's in Salt Lake. That was like 2 hours ago.
she has another drink at the bar. She downs yet another drink as she prepares to call Davis. She then pours herself another and takes a sip of it over the phone. This closes the episode with a total of 4 drinks. The analytical rating ended up being a 5 out of 5. For me, personally, I rate this episode a 4.5 out of 5. It's a fantastic first episode and a really wonderful hook to get the series started. The music in this episode was also spectacular. The Event by Dave Porter is a track that really stuck out to me during my rewatch. I don't really have any issues with this episode, it just didn't feel like a 5 out of 5 for me, especially when I've seen what Vince can do with other episodes of TV. Overall though, I think it hit in every category for me and really got me excited for what was to come. Carol wakes up to discover the nightmare she experienced was all too real, as she notices Helen still lying where she left her. She has to come to terms with it and attempts to bury Helen. Several hours pass and Carol is shocked, as Zosha suddenly appears in her garden. They offer to assist Carol and recommends that she take care of herself. Carol quickly objects and keeps her distance from the others. Zosha also shares that Carol is being watched by an Air Force drone. Zosha heads out as they realize they're upsetting Carol. It doesn't take long for Carol to stop them, clocking that they look extremely similar to Raban, the love interest in her romantasy novel. We also get confirmation that Raban was intended to be a woman, but Carol chickened out, something she had kept a secret from the world. She quickly realizes that Helen joined the others, meaning they have all her memories. Carol flips the fuck out for stealing Helen's memories and pushes Zosha, causing everyone to begin tweaking out. She gets back to digging Helen's grave and discovers that she killed a large amount of people by taking her anger out on the others, as they're strongly affected by her negative emotions. Carol is too weak to keep going after this and allows Zosha to continue burying Helen. Later, Carol learns that there are now 13 survivors, including herself, as the others discovered Manusos just that morning, as well as the realization that she injured one of the other 12 mildly. Carol arranges to meet with the English-speaking old schoolers so she can shut out the others as they discuss how to fix the world. Carol heads out to Spain and is accommodated on Air Force One by Kumba Diabate, probably the most standout of the old schoolers aside from Manusos and Carol. He seems to be relishing this new world and surrounding himself with everything he could dream of, including a horde of supermodels. Somehow, no one aside from Carol seems to be visibly bothered by this. Carol requests that all the old schoolers are left alone to chat. It doesn't take long for Carol to realize that none of the 6 aside from herself are at all bothered by the joining. Kusamayu even wants to join them so she can be with her family. It's also immediately clear that Lakshmi hates Carol's guts, as she blames her for the death of her grandfather and the tweaking that Carol caused earlier in the episode. There's something that bothers me about this whole scene, honestly, and it's the old schoolers. Lakshmi and Diabate are able to separate themselves as unique characters amongst the group, while the rest just kind of blend into the background and make for forgettable characters. For a series that focuses so much on individuality, there isn't anything that notably characterized the other 3, aside from maybe Kusamayu wanting to join the others, but that's such a small thing. They all head out for a meal and we learn the others cannot purposefully kill anything. We also discover nearly 1 billion people died during the joining. Something that stood out to me in this scene is that it seems the others are capable of being unhappy, or at least emulating sadness, as Zosha seems pretty bummed out discussing the number of deaths. Lakshmi also gets one little fuck you in at Carol by dropping the bombshell that she killed 11 million during her freak out at Zosha. Immediately uncomfortable with this information, Carol steps out and prepares to head home, but not before plonking onto the rocks. The others rush to help her, causing Carol to freak out once more, leading the others to tweak out once more. She wakes up the following morning to discover all the old schoolers aside from Kumba have left. She sits down for another chat and Kumba informs her he's headed out to Las Vegas as he's intrigued by the ghost of Elvis. He also requests that Zosha accompanies him so he can do the obvious. Carol calls out Kumba for his gross behavior, as well as how absurd it is that Zosha is entirely fine with it provided Carol gives her blessing. Carol insists that Zosha just make a choice. However, they're incapable of it, as it would end up leaving one of them unhappy. Carol doesn't stand in the way and prepares to go home, only to have a last-minute change of mind, thrusting herself in front of Kumba's plane to bring Zosha back. Episode 2 was a brilliant follow-up to Episode 1. It was surprisingly more relaxed compared to the insanity of We As Us, but I really liked how it separated itself. The world building in this episode was fantastic and really established a much larger scale to Pluribus than any other Vince project in recent times. We also get a much better idea of the pacing for Season 1 as they slowed it down this episode. I'm giving the story a 4 out of 5. I was still thoroughly entertained, but it definitely didn't hit as much for me compared to episode 1. Vince directed this episode as well and managed to keep up the visual consistency of the show. Just like episode 1, there are moments that keep us in Carol's headspace. For example, the first time she meets Zosha, we see her from a distance. It's a visual nod to the distance Carol is attempting to keep from the others. I also really love the use of wide shots in the middle of scenes. It's nice to see Vince pull away from the traditional cut back and forth between two characters for more unique shots. Obviously, it still happens in this show, but the directors have a way of putting some sauce on it. This might be more of an editing note, but there's a transition between Carol throwing up and Zosha slamming down the pickaxe. I think it flows really nicely. On that note, I'd say bravo to Skip McDonald for some great editing on these first few episodes. I'm giving the cinematography this episode a 4 out of 5. There were several fantastic shots, but there wasn't as much that stuck out to me in comparison to episode 1. The acting in this episode was fantastic. The first person I'd like to talk about is Carolina Wydra for her performance as Zosha. She perfectly represented the others and was a brilliant fit for this role. Zosha saying,
"Yesterday was the greatest day in the history of humanity,"
was incredibly disturbing to me, and I think Carolina really did a fantastic job with that delivery. The smile really makes it extra haunting. I'd also have to give props to Samba Shu and Menik Gunaratna for their performance as Kumba and Lakshmi. Also, I apologize if my pronunciation is utterly horrendous. They really stood out amongst the old schoolers and breathed some life into that side of the show. The performance of this episode would, of course, have to go to Ray Seahorn. Just like I said in episode 1, she's the star of the show. She's done a brilliant job at separating herself from Kim Wexler. I don't see Kim and Carol at all. I specifically loved her at the dinner scene when she declares,
"You are traitors. You are traitors to the human race!"
The delivery on that was fantastic. I think generally she does a great job at any scene where she's just screaming at people. Acting, of course, scored a 5 out of 5 for this episode. Once again, no notes. The dialogue in this episode, for the most part, was fantastic. I really enjoyed the segment on Air Force One where they argue on saving the world. Kumba's speech about how good the world is was a really convincing point for the other side. I genuinely love how they wrote these portions of the show. The argument isn't completely one-sided. While I stand with Carol, I can absolutely see the other side of the argument. This episode was fairly exposition heavy as we slowly learned more about the others. It was really well written, and it felt like it flowed naturally. Also, I can't not mention the line,
Casanova McBoner here.
that shit had me rolling. It's one of my favorite aspects of Vince shows. The comedy is always really well written, and you can really see that they have an understanding of these characters. I'm giving dialogue a 4 out of 5 for this episode. I enjoyed what I heard, and I had a few laughs here and there. I've only really given it a 4 as there weren't too many lines that stood out to me. Overall though, it was well written. And now, I will be discussing every drink Carol consumes this episode. Carol makes it over halfway through the episode before helping herself to a spot of wine. She then gets topped off and looks like she's about to take a sip before the cut. She pours herself another drink and downs the entire thing, followed by another drink where she downs the entire thing. There's a moment towards the end of the episode where it's heavily implied Carol is going to drink as she grabs this bottle of alcohol. Carol drank 5 times throughout the episode, bringing our overall total up to 9. The overall analytical rating of the episode ended up being a 4.25 out of 5, which I just rounded up to a 4.3. Personally, I felt this episode was fantastic, and it ended up being a 4 out of 5. It was a strong continuation of the story and really began to build up the overall plot for season 1. As I mentioned earlier, it established the pacing for the season and had terrific world building. Once again, the music for this episode was fantastic. I particularly loved a moment early in the episode where Carol looks over at Helen's corpse. The music set in perfectly. I also love the music in Zosha's first appearance. There was some subtle chanting in the background as they begin talking about how great the joining was. Carol is on her way back to Albuquerque and begins to question Zosha about the remaining old schoolers. I do kinda like how seemingly random the old schoolers feel. There's no obvious common link between the group. It's also so depressing to hear an 8-year-old didn't join. It must be so scary with the world suddenly changing so quickly. She also learns a little more about Manusos, and wants to speak with him after learning he's been reluctant to converse with the others. They then have a polite phone conversation.
Chinga tu madre, cabrón!
Carol returns home and sorts through potentially the last letters she'll ever get, with a heap of it being meaningless junk. There's also a gift from Helen, which prompts Carol to demand the others leave Helen's memories alone. Only she is allowed to remember her. She also refuses food from the others and simply asks to be left alone. Carol tries to maintain her independence and heads out to her local Sprouts to get herself some food, only to discover it's been stripped clean. She learns that the others are attempting to consolidate resources, but she doesn't care and demands her Sprouts to be returned to the way it was. And within seconds, they all sort of just rock up in trucks with everything needed. I understand it's like a hive mind and all, but this seems a little ridiculous that they were able to get it together so quickly, unless of course they had already anticipated this outcome. There's also the possibility that Carol stayed inside far longer than it seems. Anyways, the others restock the Sprouts in a montage that is disappointingly short. I can totally understand that though, as they used the real Sprouts for filming, so they probably couldn't spend a whole lot of time and delay the business. Carol heads home and her shows get interrupted as the power shuts off for the city. Yet another attempt to preserve resources from the others. Naturally, Carol calls to complain and asks for a hand grenade. Zosha rocks up with said hand grenade and Carol invites them in for a drink. Carol begins calling them out for how their actions contradict their words and begins yapping about what being an other is probably like, comparing it to being inside a postcard. In her yapping, she accidentally remembers a memory with Helen, prompting her to fuck around with a grenade. Zosha gets a little concerned, but Carol brushes it aside because there's no way they'd ever give her a real Zosha gets badly injured after saving Carol's life, but fortunately is able to summon help before it's too late. Carol talks with this squeaky shoes DHL guy and attempts to understand why they'd give her a real grenade. She also keeps pushing and realizes that they are willing to give her an atom bomb if she requested. Episode 3 really brings down the heat of the first 2 episodes. It works to build the story back up and all, but it's just not that eventful. This episode, for the most part, just serves to establish things that will be important later down the line, like a mild mention of Carol freezing her eggs. It was literally one line, so I didn't feel it necessary to include it, as well as more on Manusos existing. Unfortunately, I have to give the story for this episode a 3 out of 5. I found the final scene with Carol and Zosha to be quite entertaining, but yeah, this episode just unfortunately is a little bit of a letdown. Gordon Smith did a great job directing this episode. He picked up from where Vince left off and continued that visual consistency and gave us some fantastic shots. This particular shot of Carol staring at the dish very much reminds me of that one shot from Better Call Saul. They've done a great job to establish a consistent visual style for PLUR1BUS, and they really know how to tell a story with just a shot. This particular shot of Helen's grave looming through the window is one of my favorites of the episode. It also comes right after Carol's demand to forget Helen. I also just wanted to mention this shot. I'm not entirely sure how it works. I think they might have just switched up the focus, but I really like it. There's also this shot of the hand grenade just looming in between Carol and Zosha to remind us, hey, it's still here. I'm giving cinematography for this episode a 4 out of 5. I don't have a whole lot of specific scenes to discuss with this episode. However, I think I'll never get tired of what we're given. I really loved Ray's delivery of Carol cussing out Manusos. It's so fucking funny. I also think Carolina Widra and Ray Seahorn have fantastic on-screen chemistry, especially since Zosha is essentially this brick wall, unreacting to Carol's emotions. My performance of the episode, like always, goes to Ray Seahorn. She just crushes it episode after episode. The standout scene was probably the hand grenade scene, but I also really enjoyed the scene of her demanding they forget Helen. The glance out the window was a nice touch. Whether that was via the actress or something the director wanted, I'm not sure, but it was great. Acting, of course, is a 5 out of 5. The dialogue in this episode honestly wasn't that crazy. I don't have many notes of dialogue that stood out to me. It also pairs with the fact that generally there wasn't a whole lot of dialogue throughout the episode. However, they still kept up the comedic consistency throughout the dialogue, with lines like,
Are you the Grinch who steals supermarkets?
and
Shoot. Shoopy shoop shoop.
there's not really a whole lot that I can praise or critique for the dialogue in this episode, so I'm gonna give it a 3.5 out of 5. A fair score. What we got wasn't badly written or anything, it was fine. And now, I will be discussing every drink Carol consumes this episode. Carol does a big no-no, and decides to down her pills with the assistance of some vodka. She later toasts to shoopy shoop shoop and downs some vodka, followed by another round. Carol drank 3 times throughout this episode, bringing her overall total up to 12. The overall analytical rating of this episode ended up being a 3.875 out of 5, but I rounded that up to a 3.9 out of 5. Personally, this episode ended up being a 3 out of 5. It wasn't the most entertaining episode to watch, and felt a little underwhelming after the greatness of the first 2 episodes. It wasn't a bad episode, I still enjoyed what I saw, but it was just a bit... I didn't have as many issues with it upon rewatch, but waiting a week for this the first time around didn't make me very happy. However, I can appreciate it as we did need to be brought down from the craziness of those previous episodes to get us on track for the rest of the season. I think they certainly kept it entertaining with the visual style and comedic dialogue. This episode takes us away from Albuquerque and finally introduces us to the last member of the main cast, Manusos Oviedo. He seems to have locked himself inside the office of a self-storage facility and is proceeding to check if anyone else is out there by sorting through radio channels. Manusos yearns for some food, so he pretends this can is an Oreo and begins licking away. He decides he can't take it anymore and breaks open every self-storage unit to find some food, eventually coming across some dog food which he prepares to eat until Carol calls. Also, I timed out the call on both sides and it takes almost exactly the same amount of time. However, on Manusos' end, the gap between Carol's calls is a little longer. This also prompts Manusos to mark down Carol's name. Carol decides to head home from the hospital and decides to borrow a police car. I don't even know how intentional it is, but I really love how many different vehicles Carol has in Season 1. It really separates PLUR1BUS from the Breaking Bad universe, as each project had an iconic vehicle tied to it. As she arrives home, a group of others are fixing up her house, including the actual mayor of Albuquerque, Tim Keller. She heads inside and begins to note down everything she's learned about the others. She then continues learning by inviting the tall biker guy inside. She learns a couple of things from Larry. A big one being Helen didn't like her books. She thought Waikaro was cotton candy for the public, and her unpublished novel was just... Through this, she realizes that the others are incapable of lying, although it can still be a big struggle to extract information. Carol then puts this to the test, and heads over to meet Zosha in the hospital, asking just the right questions to learn there is, in fact, a way to reverse the joining. Carol also drops the law that her mother sent her to conversion therapy as a young woman. It's a brilliant parallel to her current situation, these friendly faces attempting to change something that shouldn't be changed. Carol decides enough is enough, and decides to fuck around with some drugs.
Do you have any heroin?
She also smuggles home some thiopentyl sodium, which she accidentally doses herself with instead of that scrumptious heroin. She sets up a camera to see the effects and plays the tape back only to hear herself talk about Zosha being fuckable, indicating that it acts as a truth serum. Carol tricks Zosha into getting away from the others and then doses them with the truth serum. She begs for Zosha to tell her how to fix everyone, but they won't give it up. Terminators begin closing in on Carol, so she handcuffs herself to Zosha, forcing the others to leave them be. It doesn't take long for Carol to realize she fucked up, as everyone else around her begins streaming tears, chanting,
What is it?
Zosha also sets into cardiac arrest, concluding the episode with an attempt to bring her back. The story for this episode was fantastic. It really kept me intrigued as I wondered what was going on. We had a mix of setup as well as action, which was brilliant. Seeing Manusos was really interesting. To introduce someone who's so separate from the story at this point had me really wanting to see more of him. I also thought this episode was paced brilliantly and definitely made me hopeful for the future episodes. I'm giving the story for this episode a 4 out of 5. Zetna Fuentes did a great job with this episode. It was fun to see a different director come in, one that hadn't previously worked with Vince before. There were some great shots this episode, and it really kept up the visual continuity throughout the show. It's gonna get old if I keep going on about cinematography so much, so I'm simply gonna give it a 4 out of 5. The acting in this episode was terrific. Carlos Manuel Vesca already amused me with his acting as he just got more and more mad with the phone ringing each time. It was nice to watch him sort of build up to that point until Carol screamed at him. I thought the others did a terrific job this episode. Zosha's face change when Carol begins asking if the joining can be reversed was brilliant. I also really enjoyed the performance from Larry this episode. They're portrayed by Jeff Hiller and did a wonderful job at filling that role. The casting in this show is honestly fantastic. These one-off characters feel so memorable. It's surely not a surprise that the performance of this episode goes to Ray Seahorn. She constantly delivers throughout this show, and this episode is no exception. I thought she was fantastic throughout the scene with her watching back the recording of herself, both on and off the tape. Her reactions to herself were hilarious, as well as her on the tape. There's a portion in there where she cries over Helen, which is so crushing. I also want to highlight a more subtle part of her performance in the scene where she discusses the joining with Zosha. I mentioned Zosha's face change, but Carol's is so much slighter in a brilliant way. I'm not even sure entirely what she does here. It's like a little forehead shift or something, but it's such a great, like, I got you moment. Anyways, 5 out of 5. No notes. Everyone was on their A game. The dialogue in this episode was also fantastic. A key highlight scene for me was the scene between Carol and Larry. I thought it was written excellently, and really provided some insight into the others. The dialogue also helped present that Carol is more intelligent than she lets on. She knows just the right questions to ask to learn exactly what she wants to know, like pressuring Larry to find out if Helen liked her books, or asking Zosha if there's a way to reverse the joining. I also really liked the portion of the episode where Carol begins discussing Freedom Falls. As I mentioned earlier, it's a great parallel to the state of her world. I think the writers chose the perfect time to drop the information, and it felt very natural too. Dialogue for this episode was a 5 out of 5. I will be discussing it over the phone. Drink and downs the moment towards the end of the episode where Carol does a big no-no and decides to down her pills with the assistance of some vodka. The overall analytical rating for this episode was a 4.5 out of 5. My personal rating would have to be a 4 out of 5. It was a fantastic episode, and it was great to see Manusos finally appear to know there's at least one more person out there who rejects the others. I don't think I'll get over just how awesome the Please Carol moment was. That's absolutely up there with my top moments in the show so far. Overall, this episode kept me incredibly intrigued, and I finally felt like I had some hope for the show, in the sense that we learned the joining can be reversed. I'm so glad we got confirmation of this so early. Zosha is being monitored following their heart attack, and the others were indeed able to bring them back. Lakshmi does her best impression of a keyboard warrior and yaps on about Ravi crying because of Carol. The others give Carol a sudden cold shoulder, so she decides to pass the fuck out. They then take this opportunity and depart from the hospital. When she wakes up, she rings up Howard Hamlin and learns the others are capable of setting boundaries. They've left her all alone in Albuquerque. She heads home, and it's finally time for the work to begin as she prepares to send out a message to the old schoolers informing them that it is possible to undo the joining. She then has it copied, translated, and delivered to the old schoolers via a drone because the others really don't want to be around her. And with that, her work is done for the day, and she goes to sleep in her bed for the first time since Helen's passing. She's quickly disturbed by wolves going through her bins, so she attempts to scare them away. The following day, Carol throws out her rubbish and discovers the others are toddlers as they appear to be only consuming cartons of milk. She decides to look into this, tracing it back to a dairy plant where there's some weird bag of something. She takes one of the bags and recreates the liquid that the others have been drinking out of these cartons. She updates the old schoolers on her findings, which realistically aren't actually anything. She also gets mildly frustrated that no one acknowledged her first video. The wolves once again return in search of food, and this time have a hankering for some Helen. It doesn't take long for Carol to catch on to this, causing her to spring into action and attempt to go all America on their asses as she tries to free the shotgun from her police car. After failing to do that, she instead resorts to ramming the car through her fence to scare them away. Carol then fortifies Helen's grave to prevent anything like that from happening again. She also creates a headstone for her. Carol then settles down to rest, only to knock the strange amber-colored liquid powder onto the floor. She then notices a barcode and heads out to her sprouts to see if it matches up to anything, which it obviously doesn't. However, she then notices it's the same bag as some dog food, which she traces to a food storage freezer. She looks around and lifts the tarp, only to find... This episode isn't the most eventful, but the story actually had me really hooked. I enjoyed the overall discovery we got throughout the episode, as well as the interesting development that the others are in fact capable of defending themselves from being hurt by running away from Carol. The cliffhanger this episode was fantastic, and definitely scored some extra points in the story category. I still remember the anticipation I felt for 106 to discover what the fuck was under that tarp. I'm giving story for this episode a 4 out of 5. The cinematography this episode was utterly fantastic with its visual storytelling. It really dove deep into the core theme of isolation throughout the episode by making Carol really small in several shots, just to show truly how isolated and alone she is. When Carol goes to bed, we get this shot showing Helen's empty side of the bed, once again emphasizing how alone she is, as well as a shot of Helen's nightstand with a book on it titled "And Then There Were None," a literal commentary of what's going on right now, as well as the fact that a theme of the book is isolation, as it's all about being on a remote island. This episode truly knocked it out of the park with its visual storytelling, and I felt like I was able to really pick up on it. So, bravo Gordon Smith. I'm giving cinematography for this episode a 5 out of 5. Well, I mean, what's the point in waiting, right? The performance of the episode undoubtedly goes to Ray Seahorn. I mean, she's pretty much the only character in it, aside from a couple small cameos. This episode really is a testament to how great of an actress Ray is. The fact that she's able to carry an episode on her back pretty much single-handedly is super impressive. She killed it this episode. Her gut-wrenching yell of "No!" when she clocks the wolves is so fucking good. Absolutely my favorite word of the episode. Her delivery was amazing. I mean, what can I say? Acting is of course a 5 out of 5. Dialogue was a little hit or miss this episode for me. I didn't have any major issues with it. It was just an episode very light on dialogue, which is fine. Carol's first speech to the old schoolers was really well written, and I think it did a good job to further argue the point to stand against the others. I then feel entirely the opposite about her following video. It's not badly written, don't get me wrong. The dialogue here just feels entirely pointless to me. Lastly, I want to address the Patrick Fabian message. At first, I loved it. And then they kept playing it over and over again. I suppose it does function to keep us in Carol's headspace, as we eventually get annoyed by it too, but it just felt a little overplayed to me. It's very much just an issue with Vince shows I have. Their cameos are very much, look, it's X person! I hope that didn't make me sound like such a hater, but yeah, I just don't vibe with several of Vince's cameos generally. Dialogue, unfortunately, is a 3 out of 5. There were some great moments for sure, but not a lot that stuck out to me from memory. And now, I will be discussing every drink Carol consumes this episode. Carol knocks over the bag and takes a sip of her drink. This is the only one she has this episode, bringing our total up to 13. The overall analytical rating for this episode was a 4.25 out of 5, which I rounded up to a 4.3 out of 5. Personally, this episode was a 3.5 out of 5. A great episode that kept me invested through the cinematography, but I can't really pretend like a whole lot happens throughout the episode that kept me invested plot-wise. As I mentioned, Ray Seahorn was fantastic. I still enjoyed what I saw for the most part. We pick right back up from where we left off. Carol begins vlogging for us and reveals that there are body parts under the top, which made for a really nefarious discovery. However, it's also just an underwhelming twist to me. It felt fairly obvious from episode 5's cliffhanger that it was gonna be body parts, but I suppose I was hoping to be wrong, but hey, it was body parts. Predictability isn't always a bad thing, by the way. I definitely don't have as much of a problem with this twist upon rewatch, as I didn't have to wait a week to see the continuation of it. We suddenly cut to Kumba as we watch him participate in a rigged card game and roleplay with the others. The others then all leave him as Carol is on her way to Vegas. She begins to set up the TV to show her discovery, but it turns out Kumba was already well aware of the others eating people. We then get an exposition dump delivered to us by John Cena explaining how the others aren't able to harvest plants or kill animals, meaning they're forced to consume a small amount of humanity in order to prevent themselves from starving. Carol then learns she's even more alone than she once thought, as the old schoolers, aside from herself and Manusos, all talk frequently via Zoom. They want to attempt to help solve the world's starvation problem and turn the others away from HDP. Carol then spends the night in Kumba's suite, and after realizing he doesn't want to be around her anymore, she chooses to depart. She then argues with Kumba a little bit, leading us to the reveal that the others have already discovered a way to turn the old schoolers. All they need is stem cells and consent. Carol immediately makes it clear to the others that she doesn't consent. We then cut back to Manusos, who's still going through radio signals, although in the time we've been away from him, he was able to pick up on an unusual pattern on one of the channels. He then receives Carol's first video. He learns about there being 13 old schoolers, as well as the news that the joining can be reversed. So, Manusos begins his long journey to meet her in New Mexico. Episode 6 is definitely the episode that stands out to me the most story-wise. I really do not like the story in this one. The body parts reveal is explained away in a couple minutes, leading the audience to sort of just be like, oh? As well as a quick removal of stakes from the episode with the knowledge that Carol is no longer fighting against time, as the others don't have her consent to be joined. I tried to give it a chance on my rewatch, but I still just couldn't get behind it. Unfortunately, I have to give the story a 2.5 out of 5 for this episode. Once again, an unfamiliar director was brought on to direct this episode. Ganjo Montero honestly really crushed it. The directors who haven't worked with Vince on previous shows have really brought their A-game and done a terrific job at keeping up the visual consistency. I also really love the use of colour in the poker scene. Kumba and his companions all in white while the opposition is dressed in black. It's a nice visual representation to add on to the good-bad dynamic in the scene. Great costume design by Jennifer Bryan. I wasn't as crazy about this episode's cinematography compared to 105, but come on. I was so excited that I noticed the visual storytelling in 105, so watching them back to back made it feel a little lesser, but it was still fantastic. We also saw the return of the glass floor shots in this episode, which was great. I'm giving cinematography a 4 out of 5 for this episode. The acting is something that will never disappoint me in this show. I thought it was fantastic, and as much as I love Ray Seahorn, it was lovely to see more of the other cast members, like Samba Shoot. He was utterly hilarious this episode. The poker scene was so fucking funny. Despite the character being a freak, I think his performance really makes me want to see more of him in the second season. I also think he had terrific on-screen chemistry with Ray Seahorn. They bounced off each other in a really great way. My performance of the episode, of course, has to go to John Cena. His speech with HDP was so well acted. Get this man an Emmy! Nah, I'm fucking with you. John Cena was great in this episode, but once again, Ray Seahorn killed it. She had a plethora of great scenes throughout the episode. There's a moment before Carol heads out that I really love. Carol tells Kumba she'll find a suite and then they'll talk more later. I'm not entirely sure the intention of this scene, but the way Ray responded to Kumba's discomfort of her staying in Vegas was really nicely done. To me, Carol playing it off as a joke feels like a lie to avoid discomfort for herself. It's probably glaringly obvious to some people, but it feels subtle here to me. Anyways, acting is of course a 5 out of 5. The dialogue in the casino scene of the episode was written wonderfully. It was so ridiculously goofy, but not in a way where it was taking itself seriously. The other breaking character and then Kumba having to tell him to stay in character killed me. A brilliant piece of comedy. I also thought the concept of HDP was explained very thoroughly and they did a good job to not let it go on for too long. I did take issues with a couple things dialogue-wise in this episode. The big one being Kumba's emphasis that he was talking to John Cena. There was a lot of John Cena told me this, John Cena told me that. Like, we get it. It's John Cena. You don't need to keep insisting on it. It was probably meant to be a more comedic part of the dialogue. I just don't think it worked with me. There's also a line that I can't quite wrap my head around just yet. Kumba discusses his Zoom meetings with the old schoolers and says,
"We meet occasionally, Tuesdays and Fridays."
By the time Carol prepares to depart, it's only been 12 days, and maybe 10 or 11 since the others first gathered. It just feels like a strange piece of dialogue to mention how often they meet when it's been such a short time frame. In editing this now, I realize just how much of a nitpick that point truly is. There was also just a little too much of Carol saying, "Oh, I have a problem," and Kumba just swatting it away, being like, "Oh yeah, you don't need to worry about that because of X reason." It only really happens twice in the episode, but it's in 2 major moments, and I'm just not entirely sure how I feel about it. I'm giving dialogue for this episode a 3 out of 5. Overall, the dialogue was still pretty good, but I just felt a few too many issues with it for this episode to give it anything higher. And now, I will be discussing every drink Carol consumes this episode. Carol helps herself to a little bit of champagne after learning about HTP, adding 1 more onto her overall total of 14. The overall analytical rating for this episode was a 3.625 out of 5, which I rounded down to a 3.6 out of 5. Personally, this episode was a 2.5 out of 5. It was a problem episode when it first aired for me, and it still was upon my rewatch. I'm not going to stand here and say, "Oh, it was trash, this show sucks," or whatever. It was still a decent episode compared to what a lot of shows can pump out, but I just had a lot more issues with this episode than the rest of them. I really didn't enjoy how all the plot points were so easily explained away in the episode, as well as the overall loss of stakes. Carol fucks around for the first 15 minutes of the episode, as she's living with the knowledge that she can't be joined without her consent. She mostly just rings up Howard Hamlin a bunch. She also ditches the police car and grabs herself a swankier car from the golf club, continuing the trend of Carol's various vehicles. We then cut to Manusos, and spend most of the remaining runtime with him. He's still on his way to meet Carol and is traversing through South America to get there, siphoning fuel out of cars to continue his trip. The others continue to hound him, telling him to take care of himself, but Manusos just continuously gives them the cold shoulder, with his machete at the ready. He does also learn that he's being watched from the sky, something that will be important later on. We then get a brilliant montage in this episode. The song Esperanza by Hermanos Gutierrez was such a perfect choice for Manusos' journey, and is definitely the song of the season for me. It stuck out to me more than any other has. Manusos keeps going and slowly develops his English. He then reaches the Darien Gap. He prepares to cross, only to be stopped by a horde of others, discouraging him from going any further as it's simply too dangerous, even offering their help. But Manusos basically just tells them to fuck off and continues his journey. He makes his way through the Darien mostly fine until crossing paths with the chunga palm. He fucks his foot up on a rock and then impales himself on the palm, which slowly begins to kill him as the infection sets in. It's not until the following day where he can no longer keep going. He collapses to the ground, and upon hearing the whirring of helicopter blades, he waves up to the sky, giving his consent to be saved. We then jump 36 days, and we're back with Carol. She continues fucking around by destroying some windows, as well as nearly allowing a firework to take her out. However, she's not so lucky, and instead fucks up a nearby house. She decides she can't take it anymore, and calls the elders back to Albuquerque. Once Zosha arrives, she can't help but break down in their arms. The story for this episode was not my favorite. I hate to do it, but I have to give this episode a 2.5 out of 5. I really want to like this episode, but it's absolutely the slowest of the season. The plot hardly moves forward this episode, and I felt like there was too much focus on Carol when she literally didn't have anything to do this episode. I do understand why they lingered on Carol though, slowly showing how the isolation is affecting her psyche, but it just felt like a little too much. The cinematography never disappoints. Adam Bernstein directed this episode and gave us some fantastic shots, once again keeping up the visual continuity with the show. The Minusos montage was just beautiful. There were so many fantastic shots. One of my favorite aspects of this montage is that it starts and ends with the same shot. It shows us the wear that the car and Minusos have gone through to get here. I'm giving cinematography a 4 out of 5. The acting for this episode was, as they all are, terrific. Ray Seahorn did a fantastic job this episode, despite her screen time. I love her subtle face change here as she begins to realize that she can't cope with this silence anymore before turning on the self-playing piano, which is so crazy to me. Literally had no idea this was even a possibility. She also utterly crushed it when Zosha returned to Albuquerque. There's so much emotion in her breakdown. It's brilliant. My performance of the episode would have to go to Carlos Manuel Vesca for his portrayal as Minusos. He did a fantastic job at portraying Minusos' disdain towards the others, and honestly, I think I love this actor already. Only took a couple episodes and he's already my favorite character. Acting, of course, is a 5 out of 5. The great dialogue in this episode mostly lied on Minusos' side of the story. I thought the montage did a great job at representing Minusos getting better at English, as it begins with him struggling with a few words and ends with him speaking full sentences with less struggle. Also, his mantra throughout the Darien was fantastic.
My name is Manusos Oviedo. I am not one of them. I wish to save the world.
This little piece of dialogue has really stuck with me. It was like the driving force pushing him on. I also really loved Minusos' speech to the others before crossing the Darien. I thought it was well written and presented an angle I hadn't even considered with the others' debate. The idea that everything they own is stolen and they can't give him anything. It was a well written piece of dialogue and really said something about Minusos' character. Also, a small piece of dialogue that I wanted to highlight actually was in Carol's segment. Her constant singing was a great indicator at how this intense isolation is affecting her, as she can't stand a moment of silence. It's a nice touch. I'm gonna give dialogue a 3.5 out of 5. Unfortunately, it wasn't the craziest dialogue-filled episode. And now, I will be discussing every drink Carol consumes this episode. Carol enjoys fireworks with a beer. She then wanders around her house and has another drink. As she enjoys her outing, she has a glass of wine alongside her meal. She then brings it full circle by having her final drink be another beer. Carol drank 4 times throughout this episode, bringing our overall total up to 18. The analytical rating for this episode was a 3.75 out of 5, which I rounded up to a 3.8. Personally, I'm giving this episode a 3 out of 5. I really tried to like this episode. It definitely has some strong moments, but like I said, there's just a little too much focus on Carol here. On my first watch, I was really disappointed by the slow pacing. While I generally had pacing issues with the first season, those were resolved after my binge. I thought it was all fairly paced, but the gap still didn't resolve the pacing issues in my eyes. It felt a lot longer than it actually is. I'm definitely glad we got more Minusos content though. I yearn for Minusos content. While I'm not a fan of this episode, I wasn't a fan of Fly either for a long time. It might feel like a random comparison, but both episodes are very much character studies. Fly dives into the guilt of Walter White, while The Gap dives into the determination of Minusos and the isolation of Carol. Despite my current dislike of The Gap, I can see there be a Fly-like turnaround for myself somewhere down the road. Minusos finally awakens after his adventure at the Darien and realizes he's in a hospital in Panama. He immediately decides there's no time to fuck around and holds an other at scalpel point, and forces the others to give him a receipt for the medical bills, as well as borrowing an ambulance to continue his journey to New Mexico. We cut back to Albuquerque, and Carol has an awkward chat with Zosha. They then get into playing a game of spit. Carol also seemingly can't bear to watch Zosha leave and be left all alone again, so she goes with them to discover the others all sleep in one place in an attempt to conserve energy. She then continues going on all kinds of activities with Zosha in an attempt to learn more about them. I want to take a minor little detour here. I remember back when episode 8 released, a friend pointed out to me just how tailored the activities in these episodes were. They all felt very purposeful. I have to agree. Each activity prompts a new discovery about the others, as well as making Carol's questions seem more natural, further masking her investigation on them. When she goes on her hike with Zosha, she mentions how she loves train horns, a fact she'd never told anyone. I actually interpret this in a slightly different way. Personally, I think Carol hadn't told anyone that she loves train horns because she simply doesn't. To me, it reads as more of a subtle attempt to ask how the unspoken communication the others have works. Carol continues her investigation and discovers all kinds of things, like how feeling is individual to the others. They know everything that happens, but they don't feel all the pain at once. That would simply be unbearable. Zosha also reveals the others want to continue spreading their gift across the galaxy, which raises an interesting idea for where I think the story could go, but we'll talk more on that later. Carol jots down all this new information and convinces the others she's writing a new Waikaro, which actually makes her pause for a moment and examine the board. I analysed this board on both watches. The long pause on it made me wonder if there was anything important that would mirror the story. The main thing that stuck out to me was love potion. Of course, there's no such actual love potion in the story, but to me, this mirrors what the others are doing to her. They essentially put Carol under this spell by making it seem like Zosha loves her, even making her go as far to abandon Minusos and her objective in favor of the others in the following episode. As part of the manipulation, Zosha takes Carol to a diner where she first fell in love with writing, prompting her to reminisce on old times. And then she realizes that they rebuilt the diner from an empty lot, causing her to clock the manipulation and flee back to her house. Later, Zosha comes by and Carol drops the facade and returns to acknowledging the others' bullshit. She encourages Zosha to stop using we and speak for themselves. She then throws her cards on the table, admitting she likes Zosha, but the world can't keep going like this. Someone has to put the world right, no matter the consequence. Zosha then takes this speech, throws it aside, and hooks up with Carol, furthering the manipulation. It's honestly so sad how the others absolutely preyed on Carol's isolation. Whether malicious or not, they absolutely used it to their advantage, suddenly showering her with all these gifts to show her the world is great with them around. The kiss has always read as part of the manipulation to me. It links back to my earlier idea about the love potion. We then have yet another time skip, this time a much shorter one of about 2 weeks. Zosha shares a memory of the real Zosha discussing her favourite food. Carol also learns she's getting a visitor. Minusos is finally closing in on Albuquerque. The story for this episode grew on me upon my rewatch. Initially, I wasn't so fond of it, but that's probably just because I was waiting for Minusos to show up. However, I've come to the conclusion that I think it's actually the strongest story since episode 2. It was just fantastic, and it was nice to actually spend time with the others and see Carol take a different approach with them. I hadn't even realized until this episode just how little time we spent with the others, despite the story utterly surrounding them. Story for this episode was a 5 out of 5. Simply brilliant. Once again, fantastic cinematography this episode. I don't necessarily have any shots in mind that I want to pick apart and analyze. Generally, the shots were just beautiful, and I didn't read too much into them. Melissa Bernstein, like every other director, continued the show's visual consistency. Bravo! I'm giving cinematography for this episode a 4 out of 5. Acting in this episode was fantastic. Never a point I feel I can discredit. There's never a moment where I feel like anyone isn't delivering to perfection. I think Carolina Wydra and Ray Seahorn definitely have some amazing on-screen chemistry, and they perfectly captured the awkwardness in the opening scene as Carol probably had her emotional outburst minutes earlier. Ray also crushed it in the later episode with her outburst at Zosha, holding back her tears as she talks about the potential of being left alone. Brilliant stuff. I'm giving my performance of the episode to Carolina Wydra for her portrayal as Zosha. I'm not an actor, so I can't speak to it particularly well, but from my understanding, and as they discuss in the PLUR1BUS podcast, she has a tough job. I've heard the phrase, acting is reacting, tossed around. The others are simply incapable of doing that. Carolina has done a wonderful job at keeping that smile throughout the show and not flinching at Carol's emotions. Aside from that one time in episode 2. I also think that this episode has done a better job than most at characterizing Zosha, and by extension, the others. They have a sense of humor. They have a Manusos-like determination to convince the old schoolers to join. Honestly, just brilliant stuff. I'm giving acting a 5 out of 5. The dialogue for this episode was fantastic. Johnny Gomez did a great job with the script, and I think the dialogue really helped emphasize Carol's intelligence, as she says just the right things to lead her to questions without it being suspicious. Each new piece of the puzzle given throughout this episode raises more questions about the others for me, and I fucking love that. None of the answers Zosha gave felt overly bloated, they were fairly concise and well explained. As I mentioned in the acting point as well, we can see the others have a sense of humor.
This isn't going to turn into the orgy scene at the end of that Matrix movie, is it?
Not unless you wanted to.
I'm giving dialogue for this episode a 5 out of 5. And now, I will be discussing every drink Carol consumes this episode. Carol has a little drink on her balcony, and I know that ain't water. She also appears to top herself off and then take a sip. Carol drank twice this episode, bringing our overall total up to 20. The overall analytical rating for this episode was a 4.75 out of 5, which I rounded up to a 4.8 out of 5. Personally, I'm giving this episode a 4.5 out of 5. It didn't really hit until my rewatch, but now I recognize just how fantastic of an episode this is. It nicely leads us into our finale and now presents a new obstacle for episode 9, the girl or the world. The discovery throughout this episode was fantastic, and it felt very natural, and I really loved the overall deeper stuff in this episode, like the manipulation, and Carol trying to covertly investigate the others. The episode unexpectedly opens 11 days after the previous episode ended. We're reunited with Kusamayu, one of the old schoolers we met in 102. Turns out she was being truthful about wanting to join the Hive and is awaiting the mystic mist that will turn her. I'm glad they actually utilized some of the other old schoolers, aside from Diabate and Lakshmi. As I mentioned, some of them are forgettable. I was afraid we'd never end up seeing them again. Even if Kusamayu simply serves to show the conversion, I'm still glad to see another old schooler in play. We cut back 11 days earlier. Manusos finally rocks up to Carol's house in his ambulance, and it's immediately a rocky start as he insists that they have a private conversation inside the ambulance, a location he believes to be secure where the others aren't able to listen in. Carol doesn't like this idea and also attempts to breach the language barrier with a translator. They then begin fighting like children as Manusos is afraid that they'll be listening. After having her phone dumped in a drain, Carol tells Manusos to fuck right off. I love how immediately rocky this dynamic is to start with. It completely defied whatever expectation I had of them interacting. Manusos manages to retrieve Carol's phone and agrees to talk in a neutral location under an umbrella. It becomes clear that they both have a difference of opinion when it comes to the others, as Manusos believes the people are better off dead if the joining can't be fixed. They then go inside Carol's house where Manusos begins searching for bugs. He does eventually discover some kind of device, which Zosha explains was actually placed by Helen years ago to monitor her drinking. Carol decides to delay saving the world to another day and sets Manusos up in a neighbor's house. After being left alone, Manusos gets a bit silly goofy and phone rings up Zosha, which Carol quickly takes notice of. She barges in and Manousos reveals Zosha told him everything. She immediately gets Zosha out of there and tries to understand if they really did share everything. Zosha explains they were obligated to tell him everything as it's not in their nature to conceal things, prompting Carol to realize Zosha's love isn't as simple as it seems. They love Manousos exactly like they love Carol, despite the illusion of connection. Suddenly, Zosha begins tweaking the fuck out as Manousos is fucking around with some new guy named Rick. Carol tries to stop him, but Manousos doesn't care. We also discover there's something more to the strange signal Manousos picked up a few episodes earlier, something that could potentially connect to the others. We get some Manousos ASMR, which quickly turns into one of those boyfriend gets hit by a car ASMR videos as Carol interrupts him with a shotgun, prompting Manousos to stop what he's doing. The others wake up again, and the phone begins to ring. I love how they don't even give Lakshmi any lines for this portion. We know exactly who's on the other end, which honestly just made for a pretty funny moment in my eyes. The others are then obligated to leave Albuquerque again, to stay away from Manousos. Carol decides she can't stand it, and goes with Zosha to live out her postcard fantasy by walking on a beach. Carol talks about how happy she feels, and Zosha tells her that it only gets better. She's a little thrown off by this, and then quickly comes to the realization that the others have her frozen eggs, which they would be able to turn into stem cells, thus converting her without her consent. They also give Carol a timeline of anywhere between a month or 3 months, which really makes me wonder how the rest of the show is going to progress on such a short timeline. Carol decides that she can't be with someone actively working around the clock to force something onto her that she simply doesn't want, and makes her return to Albuquerque, finally joining Manousos' quest to save the world. She also finally got her atom bomb, concluding the season on a mild cliffhanger. I really loved this episode. The story was up there with episode 1 for me. I found it to be very strong and was really glad that it finally restored stakes to Carol's side of the story with the knowledge that the others are working on a way to turn her without her consent. The idea of the others finding a workaround was certainly in my head when the stakes were lost. It didn't change my disappointment with that though. I'm just glad they got around to restoring them so quickly. I felt this was a strong finale and got me excited for season 2. I'm giving the story for this episode a 5 out of 5. Gordon Smith returned to direct our final episode of the season and knocked it out of the park. There were some fantastic shots throughout this episode, and paired with the editing of Chris McCaleb, made for some really beautiful scenes. I really enjoyed the Carol Zosha montage towards the end of the episode. There were so many deliberate shots that transitioned perfectly from one portion of the montage to the next. One of my favourite pieces of cinematography in this episode was actually pointed out by a friend. They noted the visual storytelling in the scene where Zosha reveals they're using Carol's eggs. For the majority of the scene, Zosha is framed from one side of the sofa, but once Carol realizes what Zosha had been doing, the framing switches to the other side of the sofa. A literal visual indicator of Zosha switching sides in Carol's mind. I'm giving cinematography for this episode a 5 out of 5. The acting in this episode was phenomenal. It was great to see the entire main cast finally meet and interact. It's actually shocking how the main cast is literally made up of 3 actors. Just shows how much they're pulling their weight. The chemistry between Carlos Manuel Vesca and Ray Seahorn was hilarious, and it's a dynamic I'm certainly looking forward to seeing more of in season 2. There was also some great physical comedy between the pair. Snap Snap Finger Wag utterly kills me. My performance of the episode, of course, goes to Ray Seahorn once again. She constantly kills it, and I love to see that from her. The scene where Carol clocks Zosha being with Manousos was great. She portrayed the panic in a brilliant way.
The fuck?
I also think she killed it in the scene at the lodge, slowly learning the truth about what the others are up to. I'm giving acting a 5 out of 5 for this episode. I adored the dialogue for this episode. Alison Tatlock and Gordon Smith did a brilliant job at establishing the dynamic that Manousos and Carol have. It's so fucking funny throughout the episode, and none of the comedic dialogue felt particularly forced. I loved the line of Carol telling Manousos,
I don't speak Snap.
There was also the line of Manousos asking Carol if she wants to save the world or get the girl. Man, they just give this guy the best fucking lines. I don't have a whole lot to rave on about dialogue, I just generally really enjoyed it. Overall, I'm giving dialogue for this episode a 5 out of 5. And now, I will be discussing every drink Carol consumes this episode. Carol has her only drink for the episode right after a Helen mention, bringing our total up to 21 and concluding the season with 21 drinks. The overall analytical rating for this episode was a 5 out of 5. Personally, I really enjoyed this episode and I'm giving it a 4.5 out of 5. My opinion of this episode didn't really change across second viewing. I thought it was still a fantastic episode of television, and I really loved the restoration of stakes to the show overall. It was a really strong one to end the season off with, and I can't wait for more Carol and Manousos in season 2. So only one question remains. What did I think? I thought PLUR1BUS was fantastic, a really interesting show, and visually stunning. I don't think I've seen anything like this before, probably because I don't watch a lot of sci-fi, but it was genuinely nice to see a unique take on an apocalypse scenario. I also had a big change of heart with this show. When I first watched it week to week, I was growing increasingly frustrated as each episode passed, mostly nitpicking the pacing, but upon my rewatch, my flaws with the pacing were mostly swept away, aside from episode 7, but I'm sure you can understand. Honestly, if you weren't a fan of the week to week, I'd highly recommend you give it a binge rewatch to see how you feel about it then. My binge really changed my perception on the show, and also allowed me to be far less critical as the path had already been laid out. I also think they've laid a lot of groundwork for a better follow-up season. While the show can be slow at times, I'm confident it's going to pay off down the line. The overall analytical rating for season 1 was a 4.4 out of 5. Personally, I'd give this show a 4 out of 5. Great first season. My major hope for season 2 is that they begin to utilize the non-main cast old schoolers a bit more. I'm not saying I want to see that random 8-year-old old schooler come up with a plan to save the world. I really want to see much more of Kumba and Lakshmi. They're the two that stuck out to me, and most likely everyone, the most. I also want to quickly theorize on where the story is headed. It's a loose, unfleshed out idea, but to get Lakshmi in the fold of the main cast, I could totally see Carol using Ravi, her son, as some kind of test to unjoin him. I'm thinking that at first, the way to undo the joining is going to be very individual, in the sense that they can only bring one person back at a time. They put a lot of emphasis on Ravi being an other important to an old schooler. I think he'd be the perfect candidate to be brought back. Something that sprung to mind upon my rewatch was this specific mention of a big antenna that the others are going to use to spread their message across the galaxy. I think this antenna is going to play a much larger role down the line, probably not even in season 2. I think it could potentially be how they distribute the cure for the joining. That is, if the cure comes down to some kind of signal. I like the idea, but I'm happy to be proven wrong. I haven't been able to predict this show so far at all, so it'll be fun to see where this goes regardless. This video ended up being far longer than I intended, but I guess I got in some kind of role during the scripting. I can't wait to review season 2 in several years' time. Gosh, I hate waiting. Anyways, thanks for watching. Bye.
Oh, Father, tell me, do we get what we deserve? Oh, we get what we deserve. And where down we go.
So not binary, but base 4. Quaternary.
Where down we go.
To Raman. The planes.
So where down we go.
What the hell is wrong with you people?
Where down we go.
So we can fix it. So you can join us.
Oh, you let your feet run wild.
You are the reason she is dead.
I want to make those fun.
Bonjour.
You
Peace on
killed 11 million.
His name is Manousos Oviedo.
Do you dare to
Chinga tu madre, cat bong!
Never mention her again. Never think about her again. Only I get to remember her. You got that? Only me. So now I'm drowning? And Adam bombed. You're the fucking mayor. Because I don't think you can lie to me. Do you have any heroin?
Why is she gotta be so goddamn fuckable?
Hello, Carol. This is a recording.
There is a way to undo this situation.
This whole place is filled with human bodies.
They cannot turn us.
It is the loneliest sound in the world. It's manipulative bullshit because you know I haven't given up.
You're going to have a visitor.
My name is Manu Oviedo. I am not one of them. I wish to save the world.
No.
Sosha.
The fuck?
Everything.
We love him the same as we love you.
Do you want to save the world or get the girl?
My eggs.